Welcome to Eagle Eye.
What a break from Manolo!
Interviewing your favorite USA Eagles around the globe.
Tony Lamb into the 22.
Now, here's your host, Bill Baker.
Hey everybody, I've got a very special guest on this episode of Eagle Eye, former USA captain Dan Lyle. Dan goes into great detail about the business side of broadcasting rugby in the U.S. and how far it's come. Remember, it wasn't long ago when we had to go into a bar and beg the bartender to turn on the match. Also, what are the difficulties that USA broadcasters and USA Rugby itself have in gaining sponsorship? He also shares what he feels is the key to USA Rugby's success. We go back a few years as well, and we talk about his trek from NFL hopeful to European champion with Bath Rugby. Enjoy the interview. Hey, Dan.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good.
So, what are you doing these days?
Just cracking on with AEG Rugby. I find a lot of people that don't know who AEG are. And AEG we are, and so even a couple years into this now, I'm still saying they sometimes, but we are the largest sports entertainment company on the planet. We have, 100,000 employees. That's divided into three different divisions. One is NBC Sports. We manage our own or have tenant in our buildings about 50 different sports franchises, from soccer to hockey to basketball to football to rugby, all around the world. It's crazy the reach and breadth of my colleagues, but it's pretty cool to be part of. I parachuted from growing the game, USA Rugby, kind of a mom and pop, growth mechanism in United World Sports, into a stratosphere, over the last few years, and putting a microcosm on that. AEG Rugby has two pieces that we do. One is we're an American content provider, so we're trying to help build a content strategy, media strategy in the United States. And second, we're a facilities structures globally, where we're trying to help unions and leagues and teams build on their own, get the right structures, and within that comes ticketing and premiums and sponsorship and naming rights and all the things that go with, building a sports franchise. And so we like to say that we got hired by MLR and hired by USA Rugby for $1, and we've got lots of working parts within that, and hope to formalize that a little bit more than just the sevens and a couple of other things we're doing to really make the American calendar come alive.
Now, you have your role with NBC Sports is still ongoing.
Yeah, I'm. I've had an unofficial role with them and a quasi-official role with them for since before 2009. But 2009 is when rugby got in the Olympics, and we started our partnership strategies and in my old company, United World Sports, building the Collegiate Rugby Championship, because we had a year left on the ABC ESPN deal, right. But kind of being around them a little bit before that in the formative years of when rugby didn't get into the Olympics, and having talked to them. But yeah, I've been in the thick of all of the negotiations that have been part of their rights. So they're we're going to be careful. Like the ESPN's West Coast headquarters are in our buildings, on our campus in LA Live, right? We do all that stuff. So, and we have great relationships with a lot of people. And in my formative years, Fox was the big player, right? And they still have a role to play. CBS is doing things with MLR and others, but NBC have invested a significant amount of money. They are currently, and for the foreseeable future, the top dog because of the World Cup, because of things like the Six Nations and others. And help them, guide them. And then my wife likes to say, you built yourself kind of a side job, doing, I guess, as people tuning into this, probably already realize I like to talk a little bit. So
no, it's all right. Go ahead. Well, the reason why I bring up NBC Sports, and I would like to talk a little more about your role in a bit with it, but the growth of rugby in the country, I really think NBC has a big part of that as far as visibility goes. It's behind a paywall, but they still have a bunch of games on regular NBC Sports, as you know. Well, how much impact do you think a network like NBC getting rugby on TV has in the growth of the game here?
Well, I think obviously they were brought in directly because of the Olympics, right? So they are the Olympic network at least until 2032. That window is where they see a lot of sports, and they've become, this because of that, probably the default international network in a lot of ways. But other ones are growing, or particularly as soccer is becoming more and more popular with Bundesliga and Champions League, not just the Premier League. But the Premier League then, as they brought that in outside of just the sevens, which they started to do, and they really like the brand value of the collegiate side of things because they only have Notre Dame, so they, having all of those Ohio States and Michigans and UCLAs mixed together with the Lindenwoods and Lifes and things like that is a good mixture for them. But it's really that sevens mantra. Then they pivoted into the Premier League, and they saw how many expats and how many people were, in America, not just soccer fans, but international fans. Right. But we started talking about the Premiership, right, as a kind of a parallel, very easy buy-in strategy for them. And then they just started kind of putting a string through a little bit of the popcorn, and as broadcast has evolved, meaning that it's not just a linear conversation. Everyone's watching it all. I mean, I've got my iPhone right here. I've got my iPad sitting right here. I've got this computer. The TV's on the wall over there. In my office, is that as everything is evolving into this digital meets linear world, they started to see the value of both of those, and really have made their strategy kind of parallel the evolving world of broadcasting.
Right, and I feel like the other networks, other than, say, CBS Sports has MLR, ESPN already has their package, NBC has a great package, but I feel like there's other networks out there that just aren't getting on board yet. Is there still room for expansion right now? Is that something that you see growing? Is that going to, or when?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. I think that if everyone looks at the American landscape as well as the international landscape, and there might be more, but give or take, there's about 18 different properties, right? You got men's and women's, sevens and 15s in America, some college, some high school, a few bits and pieces, but then you add MITRE and Pro 14 and Top 14 and Six Nations and Tri Nations and all of those things together. You're going to need multiple different groups. It's not a one-stop shop, right? Here, this is the while NBC is the current home for rugby because it's got the most content, it's probably the most content that makes sense from an American or expat perspective because it's that 7 to 11 in the morning stuff where our live stuff is going on. Let's make no mistake that if that stuff was on in the second half of the day, they wouldn't have the room on linear to do that, and certainly have the ambition to do that. But with the onset of digital and all of these different platforms, that's where everybody is making. That's why NBC just announced and did Peacock, right? They were going to launch that with the Olympics. They've already moved Premier League onto that for the consumer,
right?
As part of their premium package. So you get $4.99 and you get not just Premier League but all of their content. So that Peacock is kind of a combination of Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, a little bit of Hulu mixed together, right? And everybody knows. So Comcast is the parent company, right? They're one of the largest cable providers, internet providers out there. So they're mixing this. Okay, I'm delivering this to you through the internet. I want you to have this cable or this Peacock platform to which you're then going to uplift through all of these other channels. And if they're mine, it's even better. If there's somebody else's, which is what cable is, right? It's an aggregate of all these different people. All of that stuff put together is a value proposition. So when people say, I've got to pay for this or it's behind the paywall and things like that, you're already paying $90, $150, $250 for your cable that's an aggregate, right? Now it's really just slicing and dicing as the reaggregation is going to happen kind of on the digital structure, right? And paying for it there, right? And it was never on this for very, very, you didn't take your kid to a bar 5-7 years ago to watch rugby, right? So we've come a long way, in a lot of ways, but the availability, it'll continue to be available. There'll be more people parachuting in. and it'll be a matter of what's the right platform. And if you're to talk about the future, which we can talk about moving forward for American rugby, there's a bit of a secret sauce that's boiling away over here that some other sports have done, but that could be the future for us.
We've come far, like you just said, over the past 8 years, or even less, as far as having to go to a bar and convincing the bartender to turn on the game. Is money being made, or if not, when do you think that would happen? Like, is NBC profiting from this?
The Rugby World Cup and the Six Nations are profit centers for NBC,
right,
that allow them to do other things, as we move along, right? And because the sponsors that are connected to, even though they might be American brands or brands that Americans are familiar with, are generally done, like the HSBC 7 Series or the World Cup sponsors are done through those platforms. And so they don't automatically, come here. When people say, why isn't there more on linear? Because the sponsors don't see the value in the American market yet, right?
Right.
And there's a chicken and the egg to that, as everyone knows. But the advent of linear, where where Bill Baker and Dan Lyle will pay for that, right? It uplifts their ability for these quote unquote rights fees, right? Because World Cup wants a rights fee, Six Nations wants a rights fee. They all have that. In a lot of ways, and this is not shooting World Rugby or Six Nations, because we're working with all those folks and they're evolving. And I think that they want the best. I know they want the best for the U.S. market. It's about the right plan now. That they were selling it to pay-per-view structures that never created a volume dialogue, right? It's a right conversation to be had in the Twitter sphere or anywhere else that people say, hey, why don't you, expose this? Well, USA Rugby doesn't have any money to do that, right? And World Rugby is, I think, for the first time, really evaluating the long-term strategy for America, right? And so the broadcast, and now MLR, you've got 11, 12 entrepreneurs, right, that are spending money in order to raise the value of what they're doing, right? All of that means that they've got to expose it more, right? Any media strategy has two parts: value and awareness. You're on a boat, and I mean, you're trying to keep it afloat, and but you're still bailing a little bit, while you're in a race. Right. That's kind of what rugby looks like. That's the balance, and it's difficult, for a lot of people. But there is money being made, and there is profit being returned, and I think that is a great sign for kind of the economics moving forward.
Before we move on from NBC Sports, I saw some comments from fans online that I'm going to throw a couple at you. Will NBC ever get the rights to USA matches?
So we all know that the U.S. Did their deal with Flow Rugby. That prevents any major broadcast. It's exclusive to Flow. Whether it's open for conversation, I think, is probably what everybody's talking about in this COVID conversation. Yeah. So that's that's not a political football, but it's a matter of value and awareness, and I would think that's evolving. So I watch that space.
Okay, can you get the Premiership to stop scheduling matches at the same time? A lot of 10 a.m. matches on the East Coast.
Yeah, exactly. I think it'd be the same thing as NFL saying, they're all, what I mean? They're all,
yeah.
Yeah. So, if you're watching, if you've got 32 teams or 12 teams, it's very difficult, right? To do that, you'd be playing all day, right? One started in the morning and finished at 10 o'clock at night. So, that's just sports,
Okay, if a match has a few Eagles playing, does NBC have the option to air that outside the paywall? I guess there's a match on there.
No, generally not. There's usually, because BT is the partner over there, BT Sports, and they generally book the games ahead of time. And then NBC fits them in the windows that they have based upon all the other sports that they have. They usually every quarter, meaning the calendar year quarter, the next round is released, or the kickoff times. They know who's playing who. So Dan's playing Bill, but what at Bill's house, but what time are we playing, right? So that's some of that stuff evolves and makes things. And And Premiership this past year, as you know, who covers this extremely well. They're starting to obviously produce the for the American fans, graphics and things like that. So.
Right. Okay. One more comment. Loving these midweek games. Let's keep it going post-COVID.
Yeah, I think a lot of the players really like it as well, right? I mean, certainly it's not without its challenges because of injury and squad sizes and things like that, right? To me, the season is too long, and there's not enough recovery period and then preseason and things like that. Now most of the science points to that, right? But we get caught up into, rightly so sometimes, the head injury conversation or the kind of the soft tissue issues that are going on. I think it limits the amount of training that you have to do during the week, right? So you're not beating each other up, and there's still a lot of old school methods being done in there. So I think it's great that this has happened. Some of these positive consequences of COVID,
right?
So that they can evaluate and look at it, because the global season and having less interruption going from Cup to Premiership to Europe to Six Nations to, that stuff is maddening to broadcasters, sponsors, and fans, right? It's like, but so having more consistency, and maybe by being able to throw in 3 or 4 midweek games throughout the year or more, shortens and makes it more concentrated. And if you heard interviews like Danny Kerr from Harlequins, a long-time England player as well, he's like, I love this, man. It was less, my 33-year-old body is not mine, but I retired at 33, 34 as well. It's like it's not about it's the recovery periods, right? It's like when you're getting older, it's just harder. You don't bounce back as quick,
Let's go back a bit. We'd love to talk to you about a bit of your playing career, leading into USA and such. If I read correctly, you were going for an NFL spot at one point when you were in early 20s. And you picked up rugby to stay in shape for NFL possibilities.
I had some tryouts with the Redskins out of college, when I graduated from VMI, and kind of bounced back and forth in and out of trials. And I started playing to keep in shape. And then my first cousin, Mark Casey, played for Washington Rugby Club. And I had a bunch of buddies in college that played rugby, so I'd seen it and all that kind of stuff. And he said, why don't you come and run around with us? There were no sports performance centers back then, right? You had like Gold's Gym, right? And so there was no place that a guy trying to make the NFL went with a bunch of other guys that were trying to make it, these exos centers or things like that. There was nothing like that. So I started playing Washington Rugby Club and trying to do the NFL. And in a very quick period of time, over the course of just a few months, I got a call from Ed Schramm, who was the manager of the Eagles at the time. I took the phone call because my cousin picked up the phone, and I had no idea who Ed Schramm was. And he said, Ed Schramm from the Eagles is calling, and I'm thinking it's the Philadelphia Eagles.
Oh, right. Oh, nice.
And I'm like, hey, what's going on? He's like, hey, and so long short of it, they wanted me to come train with them, and they made me a bit of a pilot project, So I went to 3 or 4 different tours with them, but knowing I wasn't going to play. Played a couple of sevens events very quickly, went to the Malaysian 10s, which was a thing back then, and just quickly kind of got accelerated into it. And most of that was the masterminding of Jack Clark, who was the coach at the time. So he and I had a really good number of coaches and U.S. players on the Washington club back then, and so had a good learning curve. Realizing in the wintertime I couldn't train, so went to Aspen, did the summertime there. And then realized that I couldn't train in the winter there. So looked at Old Blue and Ombak and chose Ombak pretty much because of Eddie Ayew, who was the trainer at the time, and the guys, of course, the weather, and a few other factors, and went down there. So that over the course of 18 months, 2 years, I did make the NFL for that 93 season, right? And I trained and was in workouts and doing different things with Darryl Green and Art Monk and all, did the whole thing. It was involved in the environment, and long and short of it, I was in San Diego, and the special teams coach for the Vikings, Minnesota Vikings, lived in San Diego. His name was Gary Zahner. And he said, hey, we really need another tight end and long snapper and a bunch of stuff. And, he said, why don't you come up and do a tryout? So I went up and was up there, and Denny Green was the coach at the time. And Mike Tice, who became the head coach over time, was the tight end coach. And Bill, I had the best workout I've ever had in my life, and I've been playing rugby. So I was more open chain running, all the things that fitter. So I was able to do a lot of things that, on football field, you think you can do, but I was able to do that. And, just caught every ball, ran super fast, did all the stuff. And they offered me the contract, which is that's
that's outstanding.
But this contract from the Vikings came the same time the Bath contract came.
Oh,
literally. And so I had a Minnesota Vikings contract and a Bath Rugby contract in front of me. All of my American friends were like, "You're nuts! Well, you're of course going to do that and all this stuff." And I knew the business of the NFL, right? You got to make it past the third game. You're not guaranteed. And I'd been playing rugby. I'd really fallen in love with what I was doing and the people and traveling and all that kind of stuff. And it was more guaranteed money, even though it was like most Americans, you kind of get these 1 year periods with a potential if you do well. So and I did my research. Bath were the best team in the world, or at least in Europe and the country at the time. And so I chose the Bath contract. And of course, my wife's from Bath, my kids. So I don't regret one ounce of that conversation, but it's
but Dan, sorry to interrupt you, but you said like most Americans. However, you weren't like most Americans. I mean, you're pretty much the first American to play professionally overseas.
Yeah, well, I went over there with there was 3 or 4 other guys that were there, doing the same type of stuff. Luke Gross, Tom Billups, Andre Bachelet there was Ray Lehner. There was 5 or 6 guys, 7 guys that were trying, just like there are now, right? Trying at different levels. I was and Tom played and started for Harlequins in the Premiership. Luke played and started for Harlequins, and then they went on to a couple of Welsh and Italian and different things and all that kind of stuff. I guess I was a week in and week out guy, right? And accelerated into a starting position and was fortunate enough to play really, really well. So that was maybe the difference. Not the first, but probably the first to excel. On a consistent basis.
Explain that environment playing for Bath. Obviously, you came from Ombach, who, I don't know, it's probably those days when you had 300 fans in the sidelines, to an environment, a crazy environment in Bath. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Bath is a rugby town, right? They were super successful. To the credit of the players and the fans, it was meritocracy at its finest. If you played well, they accepted you, right? It was a very, it wasn't cutthroat as in like nasty or dirty or anything like that, but it was very peer driven, very structured. And of course, I already knew how to be a professional, right? I knew, from college football to the snippets in the NFL and other things, I knew how to lift, how to watch film, how to follow the play. I knew all that stuff. Those guys really didn't, right? They were all mostly amateur, even though they were England players and Scottish players and all that stuff. In the 15s field, a lot of people think sevens is more adapted to crossover athletes. Certain positions in 15s, particularly like row, is very adapted to athletes as well, right? I was a soccer and basketball player my whole life, all the way through. I played both of those till I was 18 in high school. I think rugby is more soccer and basketball in its broad play. And if you played football, which obviously I did, and you have that physicalness and that. My nickname, like day one in Bath, was Pizza Box, right? Because I would carry a ball, and stuff like so. Just kind of making plays like you do on the basketball court and you do in soccer, putting people through gaps and playing team defense. I was used to that. So it was very adaptable and had a lot of great guys at Washington Rugby Club. Aspen, and Albeck, probably three of the best teams of that era, and really good guys and coaches, and then that acceleration of the national team, right? I'd already played, half a dozen or dozen Eagle matches as well, right? So even though it was just about 2 years into, touching a rugby ball. So.
I actually saw you play in, I want to say 96 in Atlanta against Ireland. I think it was 96 or 97, I think it was. But
the freezing game, right?
Wet day, yeah. So I want to talk about one match in particular with Bath. It's the 98 European Rugby Champions Cup against Brive. It was such an amazing atmosphere on TV. The build-up must have been incredible. Talk about that match. I mean, I'm sure that match sticks in your mind still, even though it was earlier in your career.
Yeah, Bath had won every single championship they'd ever been in at that point, right? They had won 10 cups, which is back in the day that you had the league and then the League Cup, which included the lower division, kind of like the FA Cup for those that know soccer. So they'd won all these, but they played different teams around the world at different times and toured in the amateur era, but, never had a way to say, hey, we're the best team in Europe and all that kind of stuff. So it was a bit of a destiny conversation for the team. And even though one or two of the games, particularly the semifinal versus Po, was like 7 points,
Wow.
It always felt that year that we were gonna win it, and there was enough arrogance to wipe away that and confidence at the same time. So it was a wonderful year, going to Bordeaux, staying at the Chateau Saint-Emilion, one of the most famous vineyards in the world.
Wow.
It was very much an international week, right, where and all the guys on the team were international. So we were almost built for that moment as a team. They certainly didn't make it easy on us that game, but there was as you can tell by the outcome of that game, there was just kind of a grit, that went with the talent of that team as well.
I mean, something happened in extra time that nearly was catastrophic to your win, and it was not any of your fault, but however you were in the middle of that play. I mean, I'm getting chills just even thinking about what that might have been like for you or for the team, knowing, okay, we have this one. You thought there was no time left in the clock, obviously. Referee had a different clock.
Yeah, that was a product of going from amateur to professionalism, right? The injury time, nebulous, you don't know what's going on. You don't know how much time so it's really hard to plan your, anything. At the end of the games, you're just kind of playing until the whistle goes, right? So that old adage. But Andy Nickel, they tried a drop goal, and Andy Nix, who was our scrum half and our captain, Scotland, fumbled the ball. I took it. The irony of it all, most people don't realize, is that I never put the ball down.
Right.
I dove on my elbows, and so I didn't put it down. That's why I got up and was running. There was no TMO. There was no that stuff. Okay. The referee was, in the same, old cotton shirts that we were, So behind the play of it. So but look, we very lucky to win it, but also immensely gratifying.
It has to be one of the most dramatic rugby matches of all time.
So with USA Rugby, as much as we've progressed with, big wins recently over Scotland, Samoa, professional ages coming in, I feel like we haven't really progressed that much when comparing to, the elite nations, the tier ones. I feel like we're still moving with them. I mean, does that sound accurate to you? And what would be MLR's impact on maybe changing that?
Yeah. Great question. And I agree. 2019 was a proof point. It was a greater points difference than 2015 for the quote unquote tier 2, right? Or emerging nations, or whatever it may be. So, I look at the development of our national team in two pies, right? I look at it as a metric pie. So how fast, how high, how strong, those pieces comparatively to the teams above and below you, right?
Right.
So does our female loose head prop, does she have the same abilities metrically as a loose head prop from England or Canada or New Zealand or whatever it may be, right? The second pie is the rugby pie. That's the amount of training hours, time on the job, skill sets, right? So those two pies together, if those are 100% pies, right? What's our percentage of each of those pies? 5 teams above us and 5 teams below us, and if everybody in America, or at least every coach in America, knew that scenario, how much time on the job you're required to get to that level of elite playing, what level of competition you need to play. It certainly goes to you've got a barometric pressure gauge with the 7th team, higher caliber athletes, playing the best environment in a quality training environment with good coaches, right? So therefore, you uplift. It doesn't happen overnight, right? And our pipeline is still not completely unlocked to more and better. We don't have enough coming through our traditional rugby pipeline and enough crossover. Nia Tapper, Lev Kelter, Carlin Isles, Perry Baker. These are crossover athletes, right? They're not coming through our systems, right? Right. So that's part of the rugby pie. So you have that. So on a 15th perspective, MLR is now here, right? To a lesser extent, WPL, and certainly if you were to take America out of the equation and you were to say, hey, how do I get more teams better? You have a commercial pie and you have a competition pie, right? Is MLR producing enough quality players and athletes that they can emerge onto the next level and be competitive? It's not about playing 10 test matches a year, right? We were on the series before the Olympics, right? We weren't very good, right? We occasionally stumbled into a few wins and things like that based upon personalities or a couple of players or the bounce of a ball. But the consistency, I think what does Mike call it, the competitors to the contenders or something along those lines.
Right.
To do that, you have to have all those other factors. So MLR is the missing ingredient. It's very American, right? It's a centralized league, individual owners, very American, right? And we're with entrepreneurs, putting into that those structures, that development is really going to be the difference, along with the commercial side of it for them, and having a quality enough competition above that. I mean, how many times do we really play in a year the top of tier 2, let alone tier 1? Right. We don't, right? We probably played Samoa 6 times ever.
Right.
When people are like, oh, you got to beat, it's like, well, we don't play them there. We play Chile, Uruguay, Argentina A, Brazil, Canada, Romania, Georgia, maybe one tier 1 country. This is male side. Our female side gets the game, probably not enough. Right. And as WPL and the talent pool coming through, that's the other side of them. America has never had a rolling calendar for test matches. You couldn't tell who you were going to play year after year. So how do you get broadcasters? Way back to your first question. How do you get broadcasters involved? How do you get sponsors involved? How do you tie in the youth, initiatives to that, meaning the activation strategies? How do you do that? Without a calendar, you're kind of sitting in no man's land. We can't sit there in no man's land and say it's all about MLR and academies, or it's just about high school and college, right? This is the American system, high school and college, right? So we've got to make sure that works, and that's producing, and that's college, and we got to have the parallel, because MLS, for example, completely disavowed the scholastic system in America, right?
Right. That's right.
And our national team isn't very good in men's, right? So this thing that produces Olympians and world-class athletes and all that kind of stuff, we need to stay connected to the multi-sport athlete. We don't want at 13, 14, or 15 to have them just playing rugby and that's it, right? We want the guy that's playing basketball and football and lacrosse to also play our sport. So that all of that put together is a complexity of why we need a robust USA Rugby, right? To steer that, and then why we need the constituencies, however they're constructed now into these new councils, right? However they're constructed, to play their roles at delivering feedback, KPIs, all of that stuff in there. So that's a business plan, and that's been our deficit for a long time.
So as you're watching USA, are there any current young players that really excite you right now?
Well, I think that, Titi and Joe Tepate and those guys now in France are really exciting players. And to have that depth of a front row, Inui and others like that is wonderful. I think that the excited about is seeing what the MLR now. I was really excited to see what this year's MLR would have produced by way of a national team. The year after the World Cup, right, where there's retirements and all that kind of stuff. What that really would look like. The excitement for me is getting a stable, strong global calendar that allows us to play games and allows us to then make the stars that much more appropriate, because it's those men and women, currently boys and girls, and that are out there, they amplify your product. The Team USA is fantastic. Wearing the flag is fantastic. Putting your hand on your heart's fantastic. It draws people in. But those individual personalities and talents are what changes lives and really it will bring more and more fans to the game.
Thank you for everything you've done so far for us. I mean, you've been one of these players I think all these fans have followed since you were playing, and seeing you progress and stay in rugby, I think is fantastic. Dan, thanks again for your time today. Looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
All right, cheers.